So now we're going to talk about the structure and functionality of the server side for the PrimeCheck app case study. So we're going to zoom in on this piece over here. Some of this should be reviewed by now. Some of this will be a little different, but you should be getting more familiar and more comfortable with how things work with Spring Web MVC. So again, no surprise here. When clients send GET requests in this case study, they're mapped to so-called endpoint handler methods using the PCServerController class. That should be pretty much par for the course by now. So we have a class, doesn't matter what it's called really, but we call it PCServerController, and that is going to have endpoint handler methods that are going to forward to the PCServerService methods. And as you can see here, these methods, we call it checkIfPrime, which takes a single integer. That's obviously for the client that sends them one at a time. We also have another thing here, which is checkIfPrimeList, which takes a list of integers and does something with them. We make this thing a REST controller by using the annotation, and that just basically tells Spring, make sure this class is the one that's going to be registered internally so that incoming HTTP requests can be directed to it if their path names match the routing annotations that we put into this class. Here's how we do that. We use the get mapping annotation, which basically says take the incoming requests and map them onto these methods. So get mapping is an annotation that's understood by the underlying Spring framework. By the way, future implementations of your assignments should have ways of checking the naming conventions of your annotations. So we should give you better error messages if you screw them up. As you can see here, we put in the names. I think we've talked about this in class, but you don't have to put the slash here if you don't want to. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. I'm trying to get out of the habit of doing it because it looks ugly, but Spring is smart enough to know how to handle those things even if you don't put the slash there. And these are basically the routing names that are used by Spring to map incoming GET requests with that as part of the path to that particular method, checkIfPrime or checkIfPrimeList. You also see that we have to put annotations on aggregate types, like a list of something, so that Spring knows how to handle those things. If you leave that at request param off of a list parameter, Spring won't know how to encode the things properly and pass the parameter correctly. For things that are not aggregates, like integers, which is just a single reference type, you don't have to put the request param annotation. You can if you want, but you don't have to. So let's talk a little bit about how things work under the hood. So as you can see here, here's the PCServerService class, and this is defined as a service. So that means that this thing is where the business logic goes, and it tells Spring to do auto detection and wiring of dependent classes using something known as class path scanning. So it'll go ahead and see how to do the dependency injection stuff properly. And then inside of this class, PCServerService, we're going to make ourselves an array of instances of abstract strategy. So PC abstract strategy is an array of PC abstract strategy objects, or really subclass objects. And you can see here we're going to have a different array entry for the structured concurrency strategy, the parallel stream strategy, and the completable future strategy. As I mentioned earlier, we could implement these using multiple microservices. To keep things simple for this example, we're not doing that, but we will get there soon, and subsequent assignments will start doing that as well. So you'll have to learn how to use multiple microservices. It just takes a bit more management. Here's the integer checkIfPrime implementation in the PCServerService. You can see what it does is it's going to check the primality of a single integer that's passed as a parameter, and it's got a couple of parts. It's got a parameter that indicates which strategy to choose, which one of these guys, And the way that works is that the order matters here. So this is the 0th strategy, this is the first strategy, this is the second strategy, and so on. And those values are passed over by the client. And then what happens here is this takes the strategy, and that's going to be used, as you can see, to index into the mStrategy array, and then call the checkIfPrime method on whatever object happens to come back from that indexing. This, of course, assumes the client knows what it's doing. You can also see here that we pass a prime candidate, and that prime candidate is passed to the checkIfPrime method for the corresponding strategy instance we got by indexing into the mStrategy array. Now, a production program would do more error checking. A production program would probably not do it quite this way. It would do it with multiple microservices, but this is good enough for our purposes. Similar kind of thing with checkIfPrimeList. We pass in the integer strategy. We pass in a list of integer prime candidates. And we also pass in a flag that indicates, do we want this code to run in parallel or not? Because obviously for the, the behavior will differ depending on what parameter value we pass in, that we allow the client to decide whether to run the service in parallel or not. And then we index into the mStrategy array with the strategy and call the method on whatever we find there, checkIfPrimeList, passing in the prime candidates and the parallel flag. This is the PC abstract strategy interface. You can see it's an interface, which means that it can have either stub methods defined or default methods defined. In this case, we define a default method, which is just going to check to see if the integer is prime. And that's because that implementation can be shared by all the different concurrency strategies, because it just works the same way. There's checking primality in parallel. You could probably do that, but we are not trying to do that here. We're just returning the result of that. And then checkIfPrimeList, as you can see, is just a method that has no implementation by default. It has to be defined by the implementation class, such as PC parallel stream strategy, structured concurrency strategy, completable future strategy, and so on and so forth. So that's the end of the overview of the structure and functionality of the server.